Good evening. It's a good thing to be welcome you all here today because you'll hear one of the best programs you've heard in a long time. So, welcome to These Are Our Stories, sponsored by the First Bank of Alabama. And when you see Chad Jones, tell him how much we appreciate this and how invaluable this is to the community and to art and history and whatever else. And Chris, if you listen, you can tell them also. Good. But we appreciate their support. Today we're going to have an outstanding program dealing with history. And one of the things that I've discovered over the years is what good history is that someone who does honest research, and we all know about that. And the second thing, it got excellent writing skills, and the third is got a great delivery. You know, they could be on television and still be very successful. And in this particular case, I promise you that our presenter today has all three of these qualities plus 4 or 5 more that we don't know about. But today we are welcoming Mike Bunn, and Mike's been here before, and he didn't disappoint the audience at all. And they were just thrilled when the thing that he travels with and travels for and travels to. But today we're going to listen to the antebellum mobile, or old mobile, and he's going to tell stories about that. But he has many other stories that he's told over the time, and he has some books that he'll be selling afterwards, one on antebellum in Columbus, Georgia, one on the Civil War, Eufaula, and then the Creek War of 1812. He is director of the Blakely State Park at Spanish Fort, and he serves on just about every board of importance in history and travel and generosity that exists. But he's one of the people that would make you feel good about history, and he helped make Alabama 200, our centennial celebration, worthwhile. He has a degree from Faulkner University and a master's degree from the University of Alabama. He lives in Daphne, and he does speak Creole, and he can speak Mardi Gras while he's doing it. So, Mike, we're just thrilled to have you. You come in and show out.
Thank you, sir. All right. Yeah, it is carnival season in Mobile Bay, and so I feel not fully equipped if I'm not throwing Mardi Gras beads or something. What's that? Is it on? Okay, it is on now. Can you hear better? I'm gonna talk a little bit louder and see if that helps. I'll try my best. Let me make sure I've got this. Okay, so what I'm gonna tell you about is my book on antebellum Mobile. And it is a book that's a little bit of a different take on what life in antebellum Mobile was all about. So I want to walk you through what we're going to talk about in just a second to help orient you to the city and the way that I approached it, because what I wanted it to be about was not just a general standard history. A lot of people have a good idea of some things about some key aspects of antebellum Mobile. And we'll talk about that, what that term means, antebellum, as well. But what I wanted to do in the book is give people a really good understanding of what the visitors to the city at that time period thought about it. And I'll explain again as we go through a little bit about why I'm focusing on them. But in my mind, you know, I love to travel, and I love to read, and I love to visit other places and learn about the history of places that I visit, and I'm sure a lot of you do the same thing. When I get back from my travels, if I go out west, you know, what's the first thing that people get back? Well, ask you, how did you like it? You know, what did you think about it? And so when you're traveling, you tend to notice things about a community and view it in a slightly different way than maybe the people who live there every day do. So you have a little bit of a different understanding, you notice different things. And so what I wanted to do in the book was to look at the people who traveled to and visited Mobile and look at during this time period and to kind of figure out what did they think was most important, what was unique, because these are people who are trying to explain something that's unique about a city. They could say the same thing over and over about other cities, but what was it in Mobile that they thought was really exceptional? And at the end of the day, what I came away with was that they provided a good cross-section of what the city was truly about, and they're not necessarily always the same things that the people who living there may have noticed. So we're going to walk through this and tell you a little bit about the context, the city, the time period, the writers, and then I'm going to go fairly quickly through a variety of the main points these people observed in the city of Mobile, which are essentially in the chapters of the book. So what I did in a nutshell is I found every available letter or really a publication that where people are trying to describe Mobile and they're not living there, and it's something that's written for other people, not independent, internal, diaries and things, but what did people want to say about it to other people? And then I put all those together, and I've got dozens and dozens. We're somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 or 75 different independent accounts form the basis of the book. And I tried to lump those into groupings. What are the things that these people talked about most often? What's most common? What are the 5 or 6 things that everybody commented on? And that's what the book ends up being. It's sort of an assemblage of what were the most common observations. So to help set the stage, I know you know your Alabama geography. I talked to some groups who are not as familiar with Alabama geography, but you know where Mobile is, down South Alabama. I drove up from there today, and you know where Mobile is, over on the western shore of Mobile Bay. A lot of people may not realize the tangle of waterways that empty into Mobile Bay. So this is the bay, 30 miles long, and there's your entrance at Fort Morgan and Dauphin Island. You come up through the bay, Mobile is right here, and you got all these 5 different rivers empty into the bay. Where I work up at Spanish Fort is up here. So we're right across from that. But you've got a tangle of waterways called the Mobile-Tensas Delta, which stretches some 45 miles. So Mobile is right here at the exit of this huge river system that drains over 2/3 of Alabama, some parts of Mississippi, and into Georgia. It's one of the largest river basins in the United States. Just a little curious, a little interesting stat, 14% of the fresh water that flows out of rivers in the continental United States into the oceans, Pacific, Atlantic, Gulf, comes right through here. That's a pretty big percentage. This is an enormous river basin, and that is one of the reasons, if not the primary reason, that Mobile is where it is. So that orients you to just a little bit of where we are geographically. And this is a quick summary, a 1-sentence summary of what I just tried to explain. I wanted to try to explain the social environment, the physical environment, the economic environment from the standpoint of people who don't live there and have those conscious or unconscious biases. What did people really think about this place? What did they think was unique? That's the basis of the book. So let's define antebellum period. When I say the word antebellum, most people probably have some understanding what that means. If I say it, you probably have a general mindset. What that means is basically before the Civil War, okay? So antebellum, it just refers to, it literally means before war. So in the South, that can mean different periods of time, though, because there's some parts of the South that had no colonial presence for a long time before this. You know, you think about South Carolina. Well, after the American Revolution, South Carolina has no British colonials interfering in its government. It's American from the 1700s all the way until the Civil War, of course. So in Mobile, that's a little bit different because Mobile did not become part of the United States until 1813. It was part of a Spanish colony all the way to that time. Matter of fact, the area that Mobile is in was acquired by the United States in the only territorial acquisition made by the United States during the War of 1812. So that colonial story in parts of the Gulf South is a little bit different than in the Upper South. So in this specific instance, I'm defining antebellum period as basically that time when Mobile became part of the United States up until the Civil War. So again, that time period, what we mean by antebellum, can mean slightly different things in different places, but that's the time frame we're looking at, circa 1813 to 1860. That's the window of time that I'm looking at in the book. So a little bit about Mobile, just a quick overview here is it's founded in 1702 up at 27 Mile Bluff, which is north of town. It moved to the current location in 1711. It was a part of a French colony when it was founded. It was the capital of what they called Louisiana, modern Louisiana, the colony of Louisiana. Then it was part of a British colony. A lot of people forget that. I spoke here one year on the British period in Alabama history. Then it became as part of a Spanish colony, all before it becomes part of the United States. So it's got a really diverse background long before we get to the American period. Of course, Alabama eventually became a state in 1819. And just another real quick, because usually I throw that timeline up there and talk about 1702 and 1711, and people will have a question in their mind. So here's the answer to it, is Mobile was originally, when it was originally founded, was up here at what we call 27 Mile Bluff. This is modern Mobile. So it is up the river system. It was founded there on a bluff to basically get out of the line of some of these enemy boats that will be patrolling through this area, to found a colony that will be protected in a lot of ways, and to be close to Native American allies, which were in this case the Mobilian Indians. That's where your name comes from, and that's where it was founded. Now this was the town as it was laid out in 1702. It was around for about 9 years before they had enough of flooding back in the swamps behind the city and got tired of trying to row all this 40, 50 miles up to bring any supplies. They moved it down about halfway to Mobile in 1711. So Mobile as we currently know it dates from 1711. So this is the city we're going to be describing here. Now the population growth of Mobile, help you understand a little bit of why I find the antebellum period so important in the city's history. Look at the slow growth here, few hundred people in 1702. Middle of French period, you've only got 300. Spanish period, you're still below 1,000. You don't finally get over 1,000 people until very late in the Spanish period. The United States acquires the territory in 1813, and watch what happens. 1820, you're still a small town, and then look at the growth. By 1860, this is the fourth largest city in the entire South in what would become the Confederacy. The population growth was enormous. It was very fast. The numbers don't look all that impressive to modern eyes, but when you look at the percentage of population growth, especially in these decades from 1830 to 1860, you're talking about one of the fastest growing cities in the United States and one of the primary economic hubs. So I've always been intrigued with that particular window of time to find out more about what made the place so unique and triggered all of that. So, give you some more context. So, Alabama cities in 1860, capital, Montgomery, 1860, just over 10,000 people. Selma, Huntsville, these are the largest cities in Alabama. And Eufaula, believe it or not, was one of the largest cities at the time. Those are the other cities in 1860. And remember, Mobile has 29,000. So, it's like 3-4 times as large as anything else in the state. And if you put it on the board with all the other cities in the South at the outbreak of the Civil War, New Orleans was the largest in the South. Then you got a huge step down to Charleston, Richmond, Mobile, all roughly close together in size. So Mobile would have been seen sort of as a second level city compared only to New Orleans. Only New Orleans was dramatically larger. So kind of give you some idea that this was a period in time in which Mobile kind of loomed larger in every way, politically, economically, culturally, than at any other point in the state's history. Mobile's a big town now. We know a lot about its importance in the state, but this was a time in which Mobile was the one true, what they would have defined as a metropolis. This was the one place. And so it just had a larger influence on the state than it did in any other period. So again, that's some of the reasons I thought that was a compelling story. I mentioned the Mobile Basin. This is what we call the Mobile Basin. That's all the streams, all the waterways and the drainage basins that drain into Mobile Bay. So all this huge footprint of land in the era when people are using primarily water transportation to take goods to market, they're trading right down here. So Mobile is in a very strategic spot for economic development. So the people whose accounts I'm basing this on are primarily people who are traveling through their area. Some are traveling on business, but a lot of them are traveling for a specific purpose because they're wanting to see parts of the United States that they had the luxury to travel and do. You know, it's a lot harder at this time to get out and travel than it is today. You know, hop on in a car, be up here in a few hours from where I live. But back in this time period, you got a lot of people that may never travel outside of their home state. Some may not even travel outside their home county. So to travel is a luxury, and the people who did this traveling wanted to see some of the main stops. They wanted to see some of the Northeast. New Orleans was a big draw, and Mobile was on this route that would enable people to see a little bit of both. And the people that I focus on in the book, though not exclusively, they are the primary people that inform the writing of the book. They are what I would generally call travel writers, and that's a different term than what we might use today. When I say travel writer today, it sounds like somebody who wrote a nice article in Gardening Gun magazine or something. So these are folks who are writing specifically to generate content to put into books and articles that they're selling for other people to read. And some of these went through multiple publications. This is a special form of writing that is incredibly popular. It's one of the most popular genres at this time period because these people are writing, such as this one here, Thomas Hamilton, Men and Manners in America. They're writing for audiences that primarily will never get the opportunity to go and visit. So we think about turning on the TV and the History Channel, and you might see something about life in some region, and you watch that for a few hours to learn about the area. This is the equivalent in book form. This is the virtual tourism, a form of virtual tourism for people who would never have the opportunity to go. And so the importance of these accounts was really very popular reading, and this would happen for people who want to visit London or Paris. To learn about these places, you went to books, and these are the people that form a good bit of the research I have in the book. So a lot of these people are traveling and are specifically trying to generate content to describe the city in their books. And some of them are pretty famous folks. That's Frederick Law Olmsted. There's George Fanshawe, which is not nearly as well known. You've got men, women. A lot of these folks are European, so there's going to be a definite European tint to a lot of the folks that we're talking about. And you know that can influence the content clearly. But I would argue that a lot of these people are coming with really very few preconceived notions, a lot of misinformation of what the South is like, and they genuinely had an inquisitiveness about what they're wanting to see, to learn about, and they want. And remember, there are a lot of them are writing this for other people to read, and so they are really specifically looking at things that stood out to them as different. If every city they visited had the same paragraphs, you know, I visited this. Got off the boat and I saw this hotel and I saw this restaurant, that would be pretty dull reading pretty quick because every place would have a similar story. So they are purposely looking for what's different, and that's what makes some of their accounts so intriguing to me. So anyway, I just described all of that. That's a phenomenal rate of growth here, 1,000%. I mean, it's just huge growth, and a lot of the people who are traveling, certainly not all the people in the book, but a lot of these people whose these travel narratives form the core of, they are traveling on what is the equivalent of an American grand tour. They had a grand tour that they referenced in Europe, that you would go to London and Paris and see other places, the big prominent spots. Well, there was a grand tour of the United States too, a little bit less known, where people may arrive in the Northeast, in New York, Boston. They would travel through overland to the Ohio River system, go down that to the Mississippi, down to see New Orleans, which was a must-see even back then for all the travelers, Europeans. New Orleans was a draw. And then they came through here, and then to get back to where they started from, you kind of making a loop, you're going to go right through Mobile, get into that river system I discussed, go up the river, and then you're going to go overland to Savannah or up to Charleston, and ultimately back out to sea. So Mobile was right in the middle of this very well-traveled route. So you got a lot of people that came through, some specifically wanting to see Mobile, others simply because they were traveling other places that took them right through. So that's why they're there. So let me get into a few of the quick chapters that really describe, that's a little summary of what they discuss. So what I did in the book was I divided up the book into chapters based on the most common recurring subjects that everybody wanted to touch on. And the first one, and I'm just going to provide an overview of some of these. The first one is not the city itself, it's just the journey to get there. This was the era of steamboat travel when it was at its peak in the South. So the first experience most people have with antebellum Alabama and Mobile is actually by a steamboat. And a lot of people think of steamboats today, and in your mind's eye, you think of it as the equivalent of a sort of a cruise that you think of going to the Caribbean or something. It's a smaller scale, but it's a cruise boat. Well, that's true in a sense, but it's a much more utilitarian form of transportation than you might suspect. And traveling on a steamboat in the antebellum South was not exactly luxury and easygoing. You had to make room for a lot of cargo, which was cotton. And these steam engines are very loud, they're very clunky, and they're banging and rattling, and the fires are fueled by wood all night long. They're constantly moving, so you're not getting good rest. Every time they stop at a dock, you've got to take on wood, take on or offload cotton. And so it's a lot of commotion throughout the time period that you're traveling. So it's not the easiest one. And look, this quote I found here, these are some of the quotes from some of the people I mentioned. They talk about the noise, and they talk about the whole boat vibrating to a point that was very difficult even to hold a book steady enough to read. That doesn't sound like the most luxurious form of travel. So that's some of what I talked about. Now, some of these boats were very well equipped in the main corridor where they had their meals. Most of the quarters were not all that opulent, but they took great pride in having these big dining halls. But the problem lay in the fact that these dining halls were never big enough for everybody on the boat. So it's sort of a first come, first serve, shove everybody out of the way, try to get to your food in this thing, which was a little bit less than glorious. And then they found, in some cases, some of the writers would talk about the fact that they got their first taste of a little bit of what the social life was in Antebellum, Alabama, by seeing how passengers interacted with each other in close quarters here. There was one or two that were traveling from the north. I specifically mentioned their accounts because they had in their mind's eye that, they knew slavery existed. But they did not have any concept of how that worked in reality. And in their mind, the only place they ever thought of a slave being is out on the field somewhere. And so they were kind of shocked, like, there's black people everywhere. And they're on the boats. And how did they interact with people was just something that a lot of people wanted to talk about because they did not understand how that dynamic worked. And they were really intrigued when it came time for some of the meals. The official way that things were supposed to happen was of course, this is a racially segregated society. White people were the first ones that were supposed to eat, and then the second meal was supposed to be for primarily the slaves. Well, you've got a third group of people there that writers are already talking about, which are free blacks, and they're like, where do they really fit in? And they became very obvious that they didn't really have a defined space. And so these writers are talking about how does this society function with these different ways to recognize class. And so that becomes some interesting reading that you probably wouldn't have from the people who were already living there. You're getting outsiders to talk about that. But again, the boats travel, they take on cotton at some of these landings. They're sliding these 400-pound cotton bales, okay, with a team of guys to put them on the boat. And you can imagine the noise and the thumping and the shouting. And every time they do this, all throughout the night, bottom line, it's not a really smooth sailing into Mobile. There's some glorious opportunities to observe the environment, and they write a lot about what they saw on the riverboats. But then you finally get into the port of Mobile. One of the next things that they talked about is the fact that Mobile kind of suddenly appeared out of the swamp. You know, this is the era before we've got the RSA Tower and all the tall buildings in Mobile. So you get into Mobile, you don't really see the city almost until you're right up on it. And they talked about how that they got closer and closer to town, and their first impression was, where is the town? And they finally pulled up, and then you could see all these wharves and the city stretched out before them, and they talked about their initial impressions of the architecture. And the first thing a lot of people do, just like we do today, is you're going to look for your accommodations. Where am I going to be staying? Where's the hotels? So Mobile had a situation where, because it was a fairly large city with a fairly large number of visitors, it had some big hotels. It also had some sort of rundown hotels, just like every city. This was an era before you could make easy reservations like you can on your phone now. So you got to town, you're not 100% sure if you're going to even be able to find a room. So the search for a hotel became a topic of conversation, and the quality of the hotels, it became a topic of conversation that is mentioned in the book. And this is an era when you may not have a private room in a hotel. Can you imagine? You travel hundreds and hundreds of miles, you get into town, and they throw you into a room, and you got 3 people you don't know in there. So this was the reality. And having people describe how people behaved, how they worked together or did not, is a way of understanding the society that, again, I don't think you're going to find that in many local written accounts. This is a different perspective on Mobile. And so I've got some quotes. I won't read all the quotes I have in here, but some people were very complimentary of the hotels in Mobile. They said they're on par with anything they had seen in New York or Boston and Philadelphia, and some of these people were in a position to know. And then others, they just could not wait to find another place to go, as you can well imagine. Just out of curiosity, I put this is a menu from the Battle House Hotel, which was a really one of the high-end hotels in Antebellum, Mobile in the 1850s. It's still a prominent place today. I mean, you may recognize that name. I think I may have a better. This is of the meal. This just for fun. Look at one of these dinners. Look at the amazing amount of food. They've got fish and ham, but they've got 3 different types of tongue and brain. Different palate in those days. Lots of wines. You've got ducks and I don't quite even baked sago pudding, so they're importing fruit, mince pies, peach pies, just everything. It's an enormous variety. Now, that's at one of the better hotels. I can promise you did not have that variety or quality at some of the other hotels. So where you ended up mattered a lot in your opinion of the towns, you can imagine. So once they get into town and find their accommodations, the next thing is they want to go out and explore the city. You put your stuff in your room, you go out, what is there to see? So the first thing that comes to mind, most of them comment about, is the weather. They could not believe how nice and subtropical and accommodating the weather seemed. Now, I will put an asterisk by that because almost all of these people, as we're going to discuss later, are passing through Mobile between the months of October and April. They're seeing the very best Mobile has to offer. I don't think you'll have the same opinion if you come to Mobile in July or August. So there's a reason for that we'll discuss here. But a lot of them were coming really in the dead of winter. A lot of people are coming through, and they're coming through in December and January, and they're just astounded of how much is in bloom in Mobile and how green everything is, even that time of the year. So that becomes a big part of the conversation. They talk about the luxuriance of the vegetation, and just they go on and on. There's lots of descriptions of the growth of the flowers and the trees and everything that was one of the things that really struck them. And there's an image here, the right of the old Bay Shell Road, and see the live oaks and Spanish moss, and this was a main thoroughfare. They were just amazed by seeing all that. They talked about the homes, and they're less concerned with just the architecture that we're familiar with, the antebellum homes, the big antebellum homes, with the fact that so many homes, large and small, had little gardens, and people would tend to them, and they were just amazed by seeing how everything was still growing even in the dead of winter. They did talk about some of the huge homes, like the Bragg Mitchell home that you see depicted there on the screen. There were certainly a lot of those, but that was not as much the focus of conversation as the environment in which they sit, because these homes would sit in an area where it's framed by trees. People took a lot of pride in maintaining their lawn and their yard, and they've got little gardens and flowers, and that aspect of what Mobile looked like really intrigued people. And they talked about the one street that they talked about a lot is Government Street, that's Government Street today. How many people have been down Government Street, Mobile? You've seen it. It's paved, of course, and everything looks so different, but back then it was still a long, straight plan going right into the forest, and you have these estates that were on either side, and people talked about that being this grand promenade in Mobile that really stood out to them as one of the really more refined streets, I would say, in their travels in the South. So they talked about that a little bit. And funny, they also talked about how Mobile is maybe not quite as refined as you may have thought in the early period. There's a guy who's writing in the paper, he said, we keep on talking about Mobile in the 1820s just beginning to become a really urban center. He says, we've been attacked to say Mobile's a one-horse town. He said, but you come and see, any stranger would find out we're not a one-horse town, because in every corner you're going to see several horses running at large, plus animals such as cows, goats, pigs, and other numberless curs. So Mobile was a place that we think of in the antebellum period. Your mind automatically goes to the end of that antebellum period, when Mobile is a pretty refined big city. But remember, just a few decades prior, in 1820, this is a city that's just coming into its own, and it still had animals running through the streets, farmers living just a half a mile outside town. So it was a different situation that evolved over time. And so as you read these accounts, you're encountering a city at different points in time, at different periods of growth. This is the waterfront, a sketch of the waterfront made in the 1830s. You see all the ships and all the masts. And that becomes, if there's one single thing that every counter, every traveler talks about and is fascinated by, is the economic life in Mobile, which is based on cotton. It's the cotton trade. Cotton's not being grown around Mobile. This is not where the plantations are. This is where the cotton is being shipped out of. And they talked about going, it becomes the number one tourist attraction in antebellum Mobile, is the waterfront, with thousands and thousands of bales of cotton lined up, and all the people working and putting those on ships. And there's an image. You can see how you can barely see there's even a boat, but that's all cotton on this boat. So these things are just enormous boxes of kindling floating down the river. And there's a lot of examples of some bad things happening with that. But this is where cotton production in the antebellum South is. You can see the darker it is, the more cotton is being produced. So your primary cotton districts, what we think of the antebellum South and the big plantations, this is where this is. Mobile is not there. Mobile is just a trading outlet for all of that. So it's connected with that, but it's not the same South. It's another perspective. People are traveling, are a lot of times they're expecting to see something they had heard about in the South, and they find out it's a little different South in Mobile. It's more of a trading center than an agricultural center. This is Mobile as it's starting to develop a map of the city. I think that's in the it's right before the Civil War. It's actually shown during the Civil War, because this is some of the fortifications that were built right at the beginning of the war. But this is what the city looked like at the end of the time period we're talking about. So you had gone from a very small city, that original corridor right here, had expanded and continued to expand out Government Street, out into the woods to the west. They talked about the fact that, seeing how cotton was prepared for shipment was a big operation. They had to press all of these bales. You compress them into the smallest form that you can with these enormous presses. They had numerous presses and warehouses that lined the waterfront where literally thousands of bales of cotton could be stored, waiting on the best time to transport them, to sell them for the highest dollar. And everywhere you go, there was just cotton everywhere, and it all showed them the amount of economic activity that was going on. Mobile at that point, by dollar amount, in certain years would rank as high as the third largest port in the United States. It was the second largest in the Gulf, second only to New Orleans. But the value of that cotton flowing out was just incredible. And so Mobile became a hub for a lot of trade and had a lot of people there from other countries that were doing that trade and selling the insurance, et cetera. So it's a different place in a lot of ways from the rest of the South. There's one great quote you may have read about if you ever read anything on Mobile, but there's a guy who tried to sum up what Mobile is all about. He said, I'll give you a sentence. It's a pleasant cotton city of 30,000 inhabitants where the people live in cotton houses, ride cotton carriages, they buy cotton, sell cotton, think cotton, eat cotton, drink cotton, dream cotton. They married to cotton wives, unto them are born cotton children. And enumerating the charms of a fair widow, they begin by saying, she makes so many bales of cotton. So this is a true cotton city, a cotton world for trading this staple that's being grown, obviously with enslaved labor by the thousands upriver. This is Mobile's connection with that antebellum South. Now, the curious thing that a lot of people may not realize about this even today is that most of that cotton is arriving on steamboats, and then it's got to go out the port. It's got to get into the Gulf. It doesn't do that on the boats that brought it in. You've got to put it on ocean-going vessels. Those ocean-going vessels cannot get to the port. Matter of fact, and if we didn't have Mobile have a dredged out channel of 40, 45 feet deep to get the ships in, we still couldn't, because there are bars that run across the bay that prohibit anything for a boat less than 8 or more than 8 foot of draft to getting into Mobile. So what they had to do was they had to transport all that cotton onto small barges called lighters, and they take it down into the lower bay where they called the lower fleet. And that's a deep spot in the bay that's right about here. This is Dauphin Island. I think I've got a different slide there. This is Dauphin Island today. This is our current shipping channel that goes up to Mobile. That's Fort Morgan. You get in here. There's some deep water in the bay right out here. Most of Mobile Bay is 5 feet deep. Mobile Bay is not incredibly deep. So this is where these boats would lay at anchor, and some would call it they described it as a forest of mast. It looked like a forest of these things. There would literally be 100 or more ships waiting to take on cotton, and they were ferried out in these small lighters. So it's a very laborious process, and they were fascinated by that. That's what one of these ocean-going vessels that would eventually take on the cotton looked like. So describing that whole process became very interesting to people. Jumping ahead to another topic, they talked a lot about the various things that would make life in Mobile difficult, which are numerous. Number one, this is an era in which there's a lot of wooden construction, closely compacted. Fire would rage. If a fire broke out, it could spread and take out blocks just before you could even react to it. And out of that, there were numerous fires. And a lot of these people would be very aware of that, because when they visited town, even though a fire may have occurred a year or two previous, you would see the remains. The construction was ongoing. So you get the impression that Mobile's a dangerous place for fire, because that's something they talked about a lot. And out of that came some building codes that would force Mobile to change its architectural appearance with brick to kind of mitigate against that fire. Yellow fever struck the city many times. This is a deadly viral disease spread by mosquitoes. It could wipe out hundreds of people in a few weeks. It visited coastal cities like Mobile quite often. And so there was always this fear. That's why they're not visiting in the summer, by the way, when this stuff is really spreading. And so they began to wonder, if it's so dangerous, why do people live here? And they concluded that it's all because it was a trading port. It's money. They said there's no other reason to live here unless you're trading for cotton. So there's a quick overview of yellow fever. You see the years that there were major outbreaks. Those are just the years of major outbreaks. And this thing could take you from being healthy, within 3 or 4 days, you're dead. So it's a pretty deadly thing. 1839 alone, 500 people died. So if you're visiting, you're usually visiting in the period of time that this is not really happening in the wintertime, but you're hearing the stories, and you understand that it can be a dangerous place. Now, Mobile, here's another little fact a lot of people did not realize or still don't realize, but Mobile is sort of a seasonal town at this time. During the cotton trading season, which begins in the fall, all the way through the spring, all the restaurants are open, all the hotels are open, people are there, it's blowing up. In the summer, everybody who can left. Hotels shut down, restaurants shut down. It's almost like a tourist town on the Gulf Coast or something. It's a fraction of itself in the summertime. And so these travelers are very careful not to attempt to travel in Mobile or anywhere on the Gulf Coast in the summertime. One other thing that they talked about a lot, moving to another topic, is the diversity of people that were in Mobile. This was the largest city, had a huge percentage of people living in the city who were foreign born. It's about a third of all the people residing in the city had been born in foreign countries. So it's a very diverse city for its day, much more diverse than anything you're going to find in the South outside of New Orleans at the time. So this was another thing they commented on, of all the various languages, the various appearances, the Europeans, and of course they talked about the African Americans and free blacks, which I'll mention again in just a minute. That's a separate chapter. They talked about the houses of worship, and that was a prominent part of life in the city, and some of those structures are still standing that they mentioned, so that's kind of interesting to see those. They talked about the fact that Mobile seemed to be very fond of celebration, and that's Visit Mobile, the tourism arm. That's their catchphrase, a city born to celebrate. I suppose it still is with Mardi Gras, et cetera. But that's a part of its history that they were very interested in things like Mardi Gras even back then. There's an interesting little side note on here about Native American history that was sort of unexpected that locals may not have written much about. But seasonally in the 1830s into the 1840s, after removal, because we know during removal not every single Native American is physically removed, there's a band of Choctaws that would come set up camp just outside of town. They would sell beads and firewood and a variety of other things, and basically set up a little temporary trading camp right outside of town. Visitors who arrived while that was going on, invariably they're going to take them to see it. And so their descriptions of getting to see these people is an interesting side note of the social structure in Antebellum Mobile. And they, of course, they could not help but being just very curious about slavery. Now, most of what the people who are arriving here knew of slavery before they got there was that that's a Southern institution. And in their mind's eye, it was strictly slaves in fields. And they found that in Mobile, you still got slaves, a lot of enslaved people. But these people a lot of them were engaged in loading that cotton, or they are engaged in building, they're carpenters. There are a lot of people are being hired out. And what was even crazier to their mind is they saw these guys and they were basically using the money that was obtained from some of that work to pay for their own accommodations. This is all with a owner's, quote unquote, participation, because he's getting a cut of the money. So it's a totally different work structure than they found anywhere else in the South, and this was a subject of a lot of conversation of how this worked, because one of them said, you're walking down the street, you see white, you see black, and you couldn't tell who was enslaved, and it really kind of, they could not make sense of how it all worked together. But they saw some of the very worst aspects of slavery in the city in the form of this. There was a slave market, and there were humans bought and sold in Mobile even this time period. And there are people who, of course, they're not going to take your visitor to see that. There are some people who knew it was happening, though, and they made a conscious effort to go see it, to understand it. And they describe absolutely horrendous scenes, things that you can't really comprehend were happening in America. And they talked about, there's one that even talked to this young girl who was being auctioned off. And just, these are travelers who learned about this and went to a place that most of the people in Mobile were not going to take their guest. So you get this intense interest in this subject, and a lot of them, what they described is they were surprised how many Southerners were willing and desirous to talk about it, because a lot of the people that they met with, they seemed to be on the offensive to try to explain why it's justified, because they were so used to everybody attacking it. And of course, you can't justify it, and Europeans came away convinced with that too, but they said that was not what they expected. They expected them to just try to ignore it. And of course, every issue of the newspaper, and a lot of these guys are writing, talked about this, how they saw just about every issue. There's somebody advertising that there's a runaway slave somewhere in the state that they think is going to go through Mobile. Think about the transportation networks. All these rivers flow through Mobile. So you become aware that Mobile may not be where the primary plantations are, but it's incredibly integrally connected with upriver. And so anytime there's a runaway slave, they're looking for them in part in Mobile, and they talk about that. Going to another topic that they talked about, again, the propensity to celebrate special occasions, they had a lot of horse racing, they had parties, etc., and they talked about this. They loved the plays. This was sort of the movie theater of the day, a playhouse, and there would be several of these in operation during the winter season. And everybody would attend the plays, and one even remarked that it's the only place in town where white and black were in the same place. Outside, maybe a church and a balcony, but this is the common denominator of Mobile. They talked about Octavia Levert, and I'm just skipping to a few topics here. I don't know if that name is familiar to you. She's a very interesting character in American history, and she became the person if you received an invitation to her daily salon where she would entertain and talk, then that meant you were somebody important. And so they strove to be invited to this thing. This lady seemed to know everybody in the state and beyond. They talked about the fact that although gambling and some degree, some of the alcoholic, some saloons and stuff, that was legal. The gambling, not so much, but they talked about how it flourished openly. This is sort of a Las Vegas of the Gulf Coast in a way. They talked about how these things would go on all hours of the night, and just there's a district where they just said the police said hands off, and had a major gambling district. They talked about some of the first celebrations of Mardi Gras. You know, Mardi Gras had been celebrated in Alabama since 1703, but not continuously in the way that we know it. It was not until the antebellum period that we really kind of revived that custom. And so some of these travelers got to see some of these first parades, which actually back then were occurring on New Year's Eve and New Year's Day rather than at the time that we do now. And we've got some people that describe seeing these. She described a Chinese procession and Greek gods, and basically these are the floats and the people dressed up in things, and she's trying to describe what it looked like. So you've got an interesting description of social life in town. They talked about the fact that Mobile loved to welcome guests. This is former President, what's his name? Knox. I think of his name in a second. Anyway, Polk, James Knox Polk. He came from Tennessee. This is right after he left office. He was going to go on a goodwill tour, and when he came to town, he had a steamboat go out and meet him in the river as his steamboat comes down. Then they got to the port, and another delegation arrived to welcome him into town. Then he got off the boat, and they had yet another delegation meet him at City Hall. Then they ferried him to a play, then to a restaurant, and the guy was just exhausted before he even got to the dinner that night. But they said all of Mobile turned out for things like this. It was not uncommon. So it was a big deal to host a celebration, and they talked about it. So what I do in the book is describe all of that and try to lump all these experiences and all these descriptions into a series of chapters that kind of bring all those topics together. And at the very end of it, I've got a little walking/driving tour where you can go to some areas of Mobile that were part of their description. And a lot of it's just totally different today, okay? But there are some structures that stand that you can, like the Basilica, the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception. You've got various homes. That's Oakley, Richard's DAR House. There's some things that do figure into these narratives that give you an idea of what things look like. And there's a few little pieces of Mobile that may still look very similar. And certainly, although we've had a tremendous amount of development on the waterfront, and with it being a huge port today, it's still one of the top 10 ports in the United States in terms of volume of trade. So it's a big operation. But you've got these waterfront views from various places around the city, and you can get just a glimpse of the environment they saw. That a lot of it's lost to development, but I try to take you to a few spots in the book that help you understand the Mobile that they encountered to the best we can, considering it's been a long time and a lot of development has occurred. So anyway, that's a quick summary of the book. Of course, I've got copies of that if you want to read more, and I've brought a few other books that I've written too. Be glad to talk to you about any of those. But I appreciate your interest and your patience and listening to all this. I hope you've learned a little bit about Mobile and Alabama history, and be glad to take any questions I can if we have just a minute. If anything that I can elaborate on, I'd be glad to. Yes, ma'am. That you mean that first image of the port? I may have to go back to see what you're talking about. The cotton. Yeah, what that was. That's a boat that's pulled up to a bluff, and that was the easiest way to load the cotton. They would build a wooden skid, and so the bluff is kind of exaggerated in that picture. There, I stopped right on it. Perfect. So that is exaggerated in that picture, but basically that concept is how they would most easily load the cotton, because these things weigh several hundred pounds. So it's easier if the boat's down here, you find some sort of elevation, slide it onto the boat. The challenge is the poor guys at the foot of this thing trying to stop it. It's going to carry them. A lot of them carried out to the water. So anyway, that's basically a cotton chute. That's a over-exaggerated version of what was all along the river. That was probably one of the highest ones anywhere on the river, but that's the basic concept. Any other questions? Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate you having me.
Thank you so much, Mike. Isn't it nice to have researchers 2 weeks in a row that show you the importance of why we need people researching and putting together our history? So thank you so much for all the work that you put into all of your research and for always coming to share it with us. We're so thankful for you. I want to thank you all so much for being here. Again, I just want to say one more time, I know we've got Mr. Chris in the back. Please extend our thanks to First Bank of Alabama for sponsoring the series, and you can clap for him. They've got some really good folks, and we just appreciate them recognizing the importance of us having things like this in our community that are free. We also want to thank the Coast Valley Medical Center and the Hickory Street Cafe for always giving us these great cookies, and I hope everybody will take a few extras home with them. And thank you to Miss Jane for being a great cookie girl. And I also want to say in the back, Dr. Shirley Spears is in the back, thank you to the Comer Library Foundation, because the hard work that she does to continue raising money to make sure that we can do things like this and that we can find good quality speakers. So Dr. Spears, thank you for continuing to do your service to the library. I appreciate you very much. Next week, we wrap up and we have Dolores Hydock, and y'all know how wonderful Dolores is, and she's going to do the story stork, where stories come from. So we hope that you'll all come back again with us next week and help us wrap up the series. Thank you so much for coming out today. Have a good afternoon.